Welcome to a UNHCR podcast on the prevention of gender-based violence. Join us as we explore the innovative work from the front lines of our operations globally. Get inspired from partner organizations who created leading GBV prevention program models. I am your host, Maria Paula Castaneda, UNHCR Talent Learning and Development Officer. For today's episode, we're going to be talking about another program model developed by the International Rescue Committee, IRC, called EMAP, Engaging Men Through Accountable Practices. And very excited to have with me Danielle Roth, who is the primary prevention advisor at IRC based in Juarez, Mexico, and also Tinashe Chitate, UNHCR Protection Associate based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Maria.
I think we're really excited to talk a bit more about engaging men and boys. So, to quote the interagency GBV minimum standards, engaging men and boys in efforts to prevent and respond to GBV is critical for transforming harmful social norms that perpetuate gender inequality and promoting the health and safety of women and girls. So, Danielle, I wanted to ask, what is your take on this? Why is engaging men and boys, quote unquote, critical?
It's a subject matter I'm passionate about, having spent the last 10 or so years of my professional journey on this. Just to start from a fact-based perspective, I think we all know that men and boys they're the primary perpetrators of violence against women and girls. I think most of us in the gender and gender-based violence spaces are familiar with the statistic of 1 in 3 women who will be victims of gender-based violence in their lifetime, but most of that is intimate partner violence. And well, yeah, men and boys are the primary perpetrators, but honestly, they're also at the receiving end of a global system of gender inequality that doesn't serve them. And I always like to pause when talking about this to say to folks that men and boys are not inherently bad. That's not what we're saying, but they've been raised in a global system of patriarchy, right? Of power and privilege for men and boys. And so they're often taught that violence against women and girls is normal, that it's necessary to maintain the social order. So why engage them? It's because give them an opportunity to, look in more depth at social norms, at practices, the attitudes and beliefs of their own societies, but also to unpack their own experiences and pressures of what it means to conform to stereotypical ideas of masculinity, and to really think through the pressure that has put on them, and to think about how they might chart an alternative path forward, whether as younger men or whether as fathers. I always like to share a story about how ingrained some of these social norms are for all of us in society. I was working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2015, 2016, and one of the colleagues I was working with was this amazing, really powerful woman. And she was really non-conforming to, I would say, a lot of the gender norms of her context. The way she dressed, she was very outspoken. She was really a women's rights advocate, an ally in the fight for gender-based violence. And we worked together really closely. And I remember at the end of my time in the DRC, we were having dinner, and we were with some other colleagues, and we just finished our dinner, and she had brought her young son, who I believe was about 6 months at the time. And he was kind of crying, as babies do, and probably tired and wanted to go home. And I remember so starkly, I remember her saying, don't cry, boys don't cry, don't do that. And I thought to myself, wow, if this really gender transformed advocate is reinforcing these same norms, that just tells us how deep it is in society. And that's really why we need to start working with men and boys, and we need to start at a young age.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for the story. It really helps to illustrate, as you said, how ingrained social norms are in ourselves. And thanks also, I think, for maybe giving a bit of complexity to the role that men and boys play. As you mentioned, in both receiving patriarchy. And now that you really set the scene here, Danielle, I wanted to ask about EMAP, about this IRC program model focusing on engaging men and boys. Could you tell us a bit about the background of the program and the program itself? And then maybe how does the EMAP approach differ from other male engagement programming against gender-based violence?
So our Engaging Men in Accountable Practice program has been quite a while in the making. Actually, at IRC, we started in the early 2000s our gender-based violence work. And it was at this same time that we started working with men, but we started actually because women were saying, please, please, can you work with our men? And this happened specifically in the Thai-Burma border, where the women in the camps there were saying, please, can you support us? Can you have some conversations with the men? And so that's when we started the work, and it went through a lot of versions, a lot of iterations over the years. And we started out with more of a traditional, I guess I could call it that, approach. We had men and women together, some dialogue type groups. And we tested that out for a while. But what we actually found in testing it was that somehow we were still reproducing the same gender norms, the same kind of cycles of power and control. And men were deciding then that they were GBV advocates and they were going out and wanting to lead the change in communities. And that's great. We definitely want to see men like standing up and being allies. And that was wonderful. But they weren't listening to women and they weren't honoring women's leadership. And so that's when we went back to the drawing board and we said, look, there's got to be another way to do this. And that's when we created the Engaging Men in Accountable Practice program. And that was back in 2014. And we piloted it in Cote d'Ivoire. And what's different about Engaging Men in Accountable Practice, this EMAP program, is that it really honors and centers the vision, the leadership, the feedback of women and girls in each community that's implemented in. And it has this dedicated mechanism, we call it an accountability mechanism. I can say more about it later if you want, where really we take time for women to develop a vision for their community and then give feedback to men and integrate that into the curriculum. The approach itself is a bit of a long approach, and that's intentional. It's an intensive face-to-face approach. It is currently 8 sessions with women, followed by 16 sessions with men, and it's always sequenced in that way so that we can make sure that we collect women's feedback and have that piece leading into the men's approach. So it takes actually about a year to implement because we do spend a lot of time in doing the community engagement work, the sequencing of the men's and women's sessions, and then trying to learn basically how it goes in communities. But it really is, it's a feminist approach. It's an approach that centers women's feedback and women's leadership. And I think that is what makes it a bit different from some of the other male engagement approaches that exist in our sector.
Thanks, Danielle. Tinashe, I want to go to you because I understand that in Zimbabwe, you have been implementing EMAP. And I wanted to ask you a bit, what have you observed in your context on this program that engages men and boys?
So just to give a context, in Zimbabwe, we've been implementing engaging men and boys in accountable practices for nearly 3 years now. Our camp context is that many of the forcibly displaced persons in Zimbabwe are camp-based. So we have one refugee camp in Zimbabwe, and it offers a safe haven to about 16,000 forcibly displaced persons. So we started implementing EMAP in the camp in 2020. And for us, we have really tried to extend it to various profiles within the camp. When we began the first pilot for EMAP, we engaged about 120 forcibly displaced persons, 60 of them being men and 60 of them being females. And we are proud to report that all of them did complete the curriculum and became allies to the EMAP program. In 2021, we took a different approach and decided to then focus on the adolescents and the youth in the camp. And we had about 258 people who showed interest and who registered to become part of the EMAP program. I do admit with the youth population, the program did generate a lot of interest among them. And what we have been doing really is that to strengthen EMAP, in 2022, we also had the safety audit to just analyze the GBV risks, the community response and prevention mechanisms, so that we are able to identify the gaps. And the community facilitators that we had actually trained, who are refugees within the camp, played a very active role in terms of community mobilization and also safety mapping. So for this year, we have been trying to target the community leadership. So with EMAP, really what's important about it, it actually establishes a sense of community ownership, because the facilitators who are rolling out the program are actually people within the camp. So it helps us to understand the camp more, and it helps us to also identify their issues and be able to adapt and contextualize the intervention in terms of what they would want us to implement.
Congratulations on all the work that you and the team and the partners have been doing on rolling out this program for the past few years, and seeing the enthusiasm it has garnered, I would say. And maybe just to understand a bit more about the program itself, I want to go back to this accountability that you mentioned, Danielle. Stands for Engaging Men and Boys in Accountable Practices. And I just wanted to ask, what does accountability mean here in very practical terms?
It sounds quite academic, I feel. I think this is one of the limitations of the terminology. But in practice, accountability is, I find it to be quite simple, right? It's listening, honoring, and acting upon women's voices and challenging harm. That's and it's the framework of thinking about how we do that in our professional lives and in our personal lives. We in EMAP, there's actual sessions, and you can imagine what it is it's women who are sitting in a room. You can imagine they're, on a mat, or, sitting on some benches and really closing their eyes and imagining what's a vision that exists for our community where there isn't violence against women and girls. What does that look like? And they actually articulate a vision, and then that vision is then taken and integrated into the conversations that they're having with men. So it's that listening and honoring and trying to share those messages in a safe way. But then it's also about how we act in our own relationships. The example I always give that I think is a useful one is, how do you act when you're with your peers? I always give the example of two men sitting in a bar having a chat or having tea or whatever it might be. Maybe it's not a bar. And, one of the men in this chat that he's having with his friend expresses, a negative comment or idea about his partner, about a woman in his life. And that friend who's listening has a choice, right? They can say, "Oh, uh-huh, yeah," or, "Oh, I agree, same thing," right? That's harmful. Or they can say, "Why would you say that?" Like, or can we think differently about how we talk about women, or find a contextually appropriate way to challenge, right? To challenge that negative stereotype, that harmful comment. That's really what accountability is. It's being really able to listen and then to stand up, right, for women's rights, to prevent violence against women and girls. And that's what we're trying to nurture through EMAP, is trying to create this accountable mechanism where men are listening first, and then they're acting as allies to women and girls.
Thanks, Danielle. And that reminds me, when we partnered in 2022 for IRC to deliver these EMAP training of trainers for UNHCR and partners. And I remember that something that struck me so much was how the emphasis on the trainers to challenge harm, and how central that was to the methodology. So as you say, yes, it's this ability to speak up. So thank you for that. And Tinashe, I wanted to ask also, from your perspective in Zimbabwe, do you have anything to add also on this concept of accountability?
In our context, sometimes as an individual, you're unaware that your own beliefs, you have bad beliefs towards gender norms. So what we have done with the EMAP facilitators is we established a practical exercise where before they do a session, they also have to self-reflect on their own biases. So we actually do a small circle, and each and every individual has to also write down and reflect on the biases that they have. And this has helped us throughout the sessions that they can also do a self-reflection and be able to bring about change within the community. So that has been helping for us as well. And also with the curriculum as well, it allows a feedback session later on when you're done with implementing EMAP, when you're done with the women group and the male group. We also have a day where women have to share their feedback to the men, and the men are able to listen to the women's issues and their concerns. So quite often, sometimes men are actually surprised by some of the messaging that they get from women. And at times it helps them to actually change their perspectives and helps the GBV programming within the camp as well.
I love that image of giving the space for the women to provide feedback, and how that really centers the program on the women and girls of the community and their visions. Nina, I want to ask you now also about the impact of this program. As you said, it's been implemented since 2014. How do you know this program has had an impact?
It's a really good question. And at IRC, we try to do formal evidence-based rigorous learning, but we also try to learn from what we're hearing from community, from what women and girls and also men and boys are telling us. So I just want to say, I want to frame my response to say that I want to talk both about what the formal learning has been, what the rigorous capital R research has been, combined with some of the stories of change that we've actually heard, because I think those two things are really important. So we've done 2 impact evaluations on EMAP. One we did on kind of the early form of it in Cote d'Ivoire in 2014. And that was kind of a pilot impact evaluation we did with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And then we went back, and after the program had been tested a little bit more, we did quite a rigorous impact evaluation with, I think, 3,000 participants in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and North Kivu and South Kivu between 2016 and 2018. So what did we see, right? So we saw some significant changes in gender attitudes. We saw significant change among men in their intention to commit violence. So at baseline, men reported higher levels of willingness to use violence, right, as discipline than they did at endline. And then from women, we really heard a lot of positive feedback about changes in their relationship, the quality of their relationship, the involvement in decision making, the participation of their husbands in household chores. And we did, although EMAP is not designed, it is a prevention program, it's not designed for this. Some of the results of that DRC impact evaluation just show that the program reduced violence among the men that were actually most violent. So it was definitely a positive unintended side effect. And we went back in 2021, around that time, and we did more learning in Tanzania and Cote d'Ivoire. And we really wanted to look like, okay, what's the impact of this program a year or more after it's been implemented? So in Cote d'Ivoire, we were looking 2 or 3 years after implementation. Tanzania, I think it was about the same. And what we heard was some similar things, but also, people told us in this qualitative study that there was more openness to joint decision making among the men, and much better like anger management or ability to control emotions among men, and greater participation of men in household tasks or sharing of tasks. But I think beyond that, there are like the individual stories of change that I think are important. So just to share, I want to share 2 with you if you don't mind. The first one is from Cote d'Ivoire. I worked in Cote d'Ivoire in 2017, and we were working in Western Cote d'Ivoire, which is a context where there are a lot of returnees, Ivorians coming back from Liberia after the conflict in 2010 and so on. And I remember I was doing a site visit to one of the places that we had done EMAP. And after the official site visit had ended, a woman came up to me and she said, thank you so much for the EMAP program. It's been really transformational. And she told me this story about how in the community, they used to call her Madame la Valise. La valise in French is the suitcase, Madame the suitcase. And the reason for that was because anytime there would be an argument between her and her spouse, he would basically send her packing. It's a really unfortunate story, but a name for her, right? But actually, after he participated in EMAP, she said that there's complete change. They're managing their conflict. Their relationship is much more peaceful, were the terms that she actually used. So I think that hearing those stories is also important. And I also want to reiterate, but also for men, I think the impact, right, of challenging what they've learned and so on is important, but also creating a space for men to kind of interact and have more of a social network together, I think is a really important aspect of EMAP. So I just wanted to share that in the DRC, when we first were testing EMAP in 2014, 2015, that those groups that formed, as of 2021, they were still meeting. They had converted into Village Savings and Loan, but they were still meeting on a weekly basis because they saw the approach and the opportunity to be together as really just important for them. So that's a bit about the formal impact, and also what I would say are the stories of change that I think are also really important, and the reason why EMAP is so in demand for our country programs at the IRC.
Wow, that's that's so powerful. I don't even know what to say. It's great. It's really interesting. And thanks also for giving examples on specific behavior change, right? Behavior change that prevents other types of violence, specifically gender-based violence. So I think that's really helpful to see, as you mentioned, the anger management, the joint decision making, all of those, the greater participation of men in household tasks, how changing social norms affect these specific behaviors that then really transform communities with less gender-based violence. And thanks also for mentioning, the impact, the long-lasting impact of transforming communities. I think that's also really helpful to see why it's so important to invest in these programs, for longer multi-year programming. And Tinashe, I wanted to ask you, we would love to hear a little bit more about, in Zimbabwe, the impact that you've seen on the implementation of EMAP.
So I think ultimately, when you're looking at EMAP, it establishes a community-owned program that's driven by the forcibly displaced persons themselves. So in our context, we have trained about 16 EMAP facilitators who are able to facilitate sessions with limited interference or supervision. And I'm also proud to say that when we implemented the first session, the first pilot program of EMAP, we had 2 male graduates. And these have now become one of our very best facilitators within the community. And men have also become more comfortable to speak about violence and harmful practices. We've also seen men coming forward to report cases of intimate partner violence within the camp. So I also think we have created a channel of feedback between us as well as the forcibly displaced persons. And also through EMAP, really the operation has been able to also understand the forcibly displaced persons issues, understand key recommendations, and be able to mainstream some of these ideas within the GBV programming. And really, since we started implementing EMAP, we have about 1,500 forcibly displaced persons who are now aware of the GBV referral pathway, because we also use these platforms to allow other partners to join us and to also explain safe referrals, how to ensure that everything that we do is also survivor centered. Then we've also been developing so many information materials that are user friendly, that are also translated within their languages, so that they're able to understand the various concepts of GBV and where they can go to report any of the cases of GBV.
Thank you, Tinashe. It's really interesting to hear how integrated EMAP is into the other specialized GBV programming that you're carrying out in your operation, because we know that a prerequisite of any type of GBV prevention is to have established GBV response services. And it's so interesting to see how you're integrating, for example, the referral mechanism and the feedback into improving quality of services alongside EMAP. So thank you for that. Danielle, I understand that the EMAP program model has been adapted to, many different types of humanitarian settings. And, I think we say how proud we are that as UNHCR, we can support in implementing this program model alongside IRC and other partners, and, how actively we are promoting it. So, for example, in the UNHCR, we're implementing EMAP in Iraq, Malaysia, Nigeria, Indonesia, South Sudan, Syria, Zimbabwe, Jordan, Senegal, Pakistan, Thailand, among others, in both refugee settings, internally displaced settings, mixed settings. This is such a variety of contexts. And I wanted to ask, the challenges that you've encountered of implementing EMAP in different contexts, and how have you overcome them?
Thanks so much, Maria Paula, and just a huge thanks and recognition to UNHCR. I mean, I think the UNHCR teams have just been such supporters and advocates for the EMAP program and real partners in this work, and we're just really grateful. So, in terms of some of the challenges that we've encountered and how we've overcome them, so they definitely vary a lot by context. But I think I can speak to some kind of broader challenges. So first, just to say that EMAP is a very intensive face-to-face engagement as it's currently structured. It's, for men, it's 16 weeks. These sessions are 3 hours each. So the availability of men is important. And not in all contexts do men have 3 hours that they're always available to meet on a weekly basis. So sometimes we have to be a bit creative. Maybe instead of meeting once a week, you meet twice a week for an hour and a half, or we bring men to a location rather than asking them to go somewhere. We do, offer them transport or some sort of other support, look at alternative scheduling. That's always a challenge. So I think the length of the sessions and the duration, depending on the context, the movement, the livelihoods, opportunities, I think that exist for men and women, I think really varies by context. But we try to be flexible in what are the ways that we can still deliver EMAP with fidelity to the approach. I think a second piece that I would imagine if you talk to EMAP implementers in almost any context, you'd probably hear is resistance, and resistance to the gender equality, gender-based violence prevention messages that exist in EMAP. And it is 100% normal. And actually, if there wasn't resistance, there would be a problem, right? Because we would know that we weren't internalizing or reflecting deeply enough or supporting individuals in a process to do so. But it's a challenge when you're a facilitator standing face to face with a group of 25 people having a discussion, and there's a really strong resistance reaction. Knowing how to manage it and react in that moment is definitely very much like a learned skill. So what we have done is we've tried to provide the EMAP facilitators with a specific process they can follow, this 5-step process that we have as part of the EMAP methodology. And it usually works to kind of combat the resistance that's happening at the moment. However, what we did find is that it becomes a bit trickier when we're talking about religious resistance. We have had scenarios where we have, pastors or imams who are joining EMAP groups, which is amazing, and it's great when they're supportive of the context. But when they offer resistance, it can be challenging, especially for a facilitator who might not know those texts, right? Who can't necessarily quote from the Quran or the Bible, so on, other religious books. So what we've done, I think, in kind of some of the newer materials that are going to be coming out for EMAP in 2024 is try to create some religious-based resistance guidance and really look at some of the key texts in the communities where we're doing EMAP and how we can kind of pull from those scriptures and for messages that are in support of gender equality. And then maybe the last challenge I'll mention that I think is across the board is really around, and comes up often, is around sustainability. And Tinashe gave some great examples of what to do next when EMAP is ended. But this is always a question that's raised. Okay, so men have participated in EMAP, now what? They're just sitting there in their homes. Like, how can we leverage the fact that there's a group of gender transformed men in the community who are supportive of women and girls and want to be allies? And so one of the recommendations that we've really started to make in the last 4 or 5 years is to think about how to link EMAP with SASA. And is there a possibility that once men have been through this gender transformative approach that is EMAP, to then link them into SASA programming? And I know at UNHCR, you all also do a lot of work with SASA together. So that's definitely been one of the pieces we've been looking at to kind of start with the individual behavior change to then move to kind of this community-based social norms change as well.
Yes, and if you want to learn more about SASA Together, you can listen to the previous episode where we talk about SASA Together with Raising Voices. Thanks for that. And Tinashe, what about you? I mean, what challenges have you encountered specifically implementing EMAP? You've mentioned some already, but are there any that you would like to bring to the table now?
I think just to build upon what Danielle shared when she was talking about issues of resistance, I think this is something that will happen in any operation or any context where you are implementing EMAP. In our context, I'll give a specific example. There's a time when we were designing our community outreach strategy. And one of the issues was we were supposed to have a focus group discussion with the religious leaders. And at the time, as an oversight, we actually sent 2 young youth who went to speak to one of the religious leaders to inform them that we wanted to have a session with them. We were faced with so much backlash. But after re-examining and actually seeing, we noticed that when we are looking at a religious context, sometimes you would want to send adults to go and speak to the religious leaders and go down to their level and be able to have a session with them. So we also had to quickly think about that and readdress it. So when you're implementing EMAP, you really have to do an assessment of the community beliefs, the religious beliefs, so that you know that you are not overstepping, and also that you are able to have a session with people at the same time. Then also, I think in terms of establishing buy-in and developing the correct messaging is also important when you are implementing EMAP. We had to identify the various groups which we need to meet with without excluding some of the refugee profiles here in the camp. That is either having sessions with the persons with disabilities, the religious leaders, the children, the men, the women, and also identifying some of the conservative community groups as well. For example, what we have done to adapt EMAP here in the camp is, for example, for conservative communities like the Muslim community, we have separate sessions with them. And we also need to be very flexible and adaptable in terms of the time, the venue that they would want to actually meet us as well. So that has been also very key. And through community feedback sessions as well, we are able to identify the gaps and also be able to develop implementation which is comfortable with everyone, in which people feel that their voices are really reflected. And as well, for example, if you are dealing with youth as well, what we have done is also to generate interest, because I know with GBV programming, there are times where the young people would not want to be involved. So we have developed very fun activities to generate interest among the youth population. We've done sports, we've done music videos, actually dance challenges, to also raise awareness on GBV, but be inclusive of everyone.
Thank you, Tinashe. I want to ask you, Danielle, now that we've heard about EMAP and its impact and how transformative it can be for communities and for individuals, what would you say to GBV practitioners that want to work more closely with men and boys and possibly even implement EMAP?
So I think just to start, I think I would say be clear about what you want to achieve from the outset. What are your goals of engaging men and boys? I think sometimes, practitioners will they get excited about approach, they want to jump into something, but without really looking at the context and thinking about what are the goals, what's feasible they want to achieve. And I say that because there are like a lot of, I think, pressure sometimes to shorten, to cut, to modify programming. Certainly we want to adapt and contextualize, but to really change some of program models to a point that they're not really those models anymore. And so I think we're just really then we need to ask ourselves, okay, what are we intending to achieve? Are we tending to give awareness? Are we tending to shift behavior and attitudes? And how we get there, I think, looks a little bit different. And then I think another thing I would say is just remember who you're trying to serve. For the EMAP program model, it was definitely developed with men and boys in general in mind, but it does do a lot of work on intimate partner violence in the context of men and women relationships. It's not really a program that was designed, for example, to serve communities who I guess the acronym is LGBTI, right? But communities with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity expression, sex characteristics. It's not really designed for that. So I always say, just think a little bit more about who you're designing for. And the other piece that I would want to, I think, mention here is if you were thinking about EMAP, is to think about this question of, and it comes up a lot for us, reach versus saturation. People get really excited about the program, and even donors, they say, let's do the program in 20 communities, which is great. But if there's only resources to do one EMAP group in 20 communities, the impact you're going to have is going to be really different than if you did 20 EMAP groups in one community in terms of shifting that social norm, right? So I always recommend try to do more groups, try to engage more heavily in a smaller number of communities than doing more across a wider swath of the communities that you're serving, because then the potential to kind of shift attitudes and behaviors is much greater.
Great. Thanks so much, Danielle. I think that would be really helpful considerations for anybody that wants to engage in this work. So now that we're wrapping up our conversation, I wanted to ask maybe just a closing thought from each of you about EMAP, about engaging men and boys, about GBV prevention. What's something that you would like to share with the listeners, maybe as a takeaway?
What I would say really is behavioral change is a process. It's lengthy, it's complex. So with EMAP, really trusting and empowering the community to implement GBV programs, it really goes a long way in terms of challenging deeply rooted gender practices. And also, it's really important when you are working with forcibly displaced persons to be able to communicate with them clearly, to be able to consult them in programmings that affect them. It goes a long way in terms of mainstreaming gender-based violence programs within the refugee system. So I think for me, really, it's really important to understand the context of the place where you are going to be implementing EMAP within the community in general.
Thank you, Tinashe. Danielle, would you like to add anything?
I guess two pieces maybe. As GBV practitioners, or even as humanitarians in general, I guess I would reinforce that change starts with us. That we have to remember that when we do EMAP, that we should be looking at ourselves as part of the process. And whenever I do EMAP trainings, I always try and share, some of my own challenges of how I might as a parent reinforce gender norms or the power and privilege I come to within the spaces that I do training. So just remember, it starts with us. And then I think it's really important to believe that change is possible. We know it is. We've seen norms and practices shift in our own lifetimes. So I think if we believe that and can support others in a change process, we will see it. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much to both of you. I really enjoyed our conversation. So thanks for deep diving into EMAP and engaging in men and boys together.